Firstly, let me compliment the organisers for giving me an extra 5 minutes above everybody else in the programme. I thought that showed a lot of wisdom. Second thing is, while they have said question time is at the end, I've been married for a long time. I'm used to being interrupted in the middle of a sentence. Anybody who wants to stop me and say what I'm saying is rubbish, stop me and feel free.
You still only have the extra 5 minutes, bear in mind.
Bottom line is the talk I'm going to share with you is a truncated talk from one that I gave to the Australian Defence Forces. There was actually a commission talk because the doctors and nurses and dentists wanted to understand the Geneva Convention. Don't worry, I've only got 100 slides. Background, we're going to look at what are the Geneva Conventions, their scope, rights, duties, and the real gist of this talk is to say to people, it's not my role to tell you as doctors, lawyers, or whatever, how you should perform in an ethical way. That's something you have to decide for yourself. What I'm going to do is build a scenario, and it is up to you to decide where you fit into this. The laws of war go back to Mahabharata and the Torah. So it's obviously quite appropriate to give this talk here in Israel, the home of the Torah. They go back to 1863 with the Swiss-sponsored Nile articles, and they followed a visit by Dunant to Leo Napoleon when he saw thousands of people dying on the battlefield and just being left to die without care or attention. So why do we have the Geneva Conventions? A number of reasons: to protect and ensure human dignity in conflict, to prevent unnecessary suffering of combatants and non-combatants, to guarantee basic human rights for those held by the enemy. And the previous talk was just such a beautiful segue into what I'm sharing with you today. And it's probably worth combining the first talk and this talk together to then search your own consciences to decide where and what you need to contribute. And finally, the idea behind the Geneva Conventions was basically to get back to peace as fast as possible. The basis of the law of armed conflict is looking at military necessity. It was interesting today, I was spending quite some time with a fellow neurologist who basically said, once you have declared war, you have declared that killing is right. That's what war's all about. But military necessity states that you should only use legitimate force to obtain a legitimate military objective. And I think about the history of Israel. I think of the Haganah and the Irgun. And they only attacked military targets, not civilians in the marketplace or people praying. And that's where military necessity comes in. It allows all non-prohibited measures to terminate hostilities. And you all have heard about the use in Syria of germ warfare, which is prohibited weaponry. It's to avoid unnecessary suffering or damage. As I've said, some weapons are prohibited, and the use of force should be proportional to the expectation of military advantage. As I touched upon just now, I often say to people that the Irgun were the parents of terrorism, except that they attacked legitimate military targets, which is also the accepted approach to war. Times have changed. We no longer have war on a global scale. We have regional conflicts, non-international armed conflicts, and peacekeeping missions, depending on your definition of peace. Modern challenges include things like human shields, the impact of war on non-state actors, and civilians taking intermittent direct parts in hostility. It becomes very difficult when you have a war based on terrorism and guerrilla warfare where you cannot actually identify the enemy. We talk about the Geneva Convention. It's not the Geneva Convention, it's the Geneva Conventions, plural. There are 4 of them, plus 2 protocols. I'm not going to spend too much time going through them, but the idea is to look after the wounded, the sick, those who are shipwrecked, looking after prisoners of war, protecting civilians in warlike situations, and then protecting victims of international armed conflict, or protecting victims of non-international armed conflict. As I said, the world has changed dramatically. Who are covered by the Geneva Conventions? And here I'm talking in a health law, medical law, legal medicine framework. So it includes the doctors, the dentists, the nurses, the physios, and medical assistants. All people who are integral to the provision of healthcare are included under the Geneva Conventions. But that includes cooks, administrative staff, mechanics, transport drivers. The difference being that those who are covered by the Geneva Convention must be exclusively used within the medical model. It's no good having a transport driver who actually drives a tank. That is not considered a medical tool. And all these people are protected people and non-combatants. Giving this talk in Israel, and actually it's interesting because I used exactly this slide to the ADF, and I talked about the Red Cross and the Red Crescent, and I actually asked, and the room was just military personnel, who's ever heard of Magen David Adom? And they all had, which is somewhat pleasing. It's important to realise that wearing the emblem, be it a Star of David or a crescent or a cross, identifies the person as a non-combatant. But not wearing it does not remove the responsibility of protecting that person if it is known that that person is part of a medical team. This should appear on military and non-military personnel, medical facilities, transport, supply stores, anything that is required to deliver a medical service. It should provide absolute protection unless the facility so identified is not being used for the purpose for which it's supposed to be identified. And having warned the place, they continue to do that which is unacceptable. Can medical personnel carry arms? And the answer is most definitely yes, but only designed for their own protection. And it's light individual weaponry and for guarding the facility as such. They're also entitled to remove weaponry from the injured as well as their ammunition. Transportation cannot carry an integrally mounted weapon or arms other than those for self-protection, but, it may be allowed to have an armed escort, but even that is stipulated, the distance between the armed escort and the medical team. Captured permanent military medical personnel are not prisoners of war, and this is an important issue. They should only be held so long as there is vital medical work to be done, and if not repatriated, they may not be forced to do other than medical duties. So if they're medical people and they are not returned to their homeland, they can only be forced to do medical work. Those temporarily engaged in medical military personnel are classed as prisoners of war, but they should again only be engaged in doing what is required for medical service. The military guards protecting medical units are prisoners of war. Civilian medical personnel should be employed under full protection and only doing medical work. Medical personnel can insist that the best care provider should be providing the best care. They should have access to battlefields, besieged areas, prisoner camps, and in fact you will all know about intermittent stoppage of war to allow medical personnel to go in and do the needful. Those not directly involved in hostilities must be provided medical care. Medical people must protect and treat them humanely. Humane treatment does not exclude informed consent. The only area where this is not covered is if it is a vital emergency blood donation or skin donation, which especially in this country was a vitally important consideration with the burns that occurred in tank units. Israel actually taught the world about how to treat burns from armed conflict. If retreating, the medical equipment and supplies should be left behind as much as is possible and as much as convenience allows. Burial of the dead is the preferred way, especially with those who have a direct aversion to cremation, such as the Orthodox religious groups. Graves should be identified and kept on a plan, and the people should have their identity confirmed. So they should know who's buried where, when, and how. Let's get into the guts of this, and it's the violations. It's easy to talk about utopia. In Australia, at least, medical personnel can be charged with violations of the Geneva Convention as well as violations of the Defence Force Disciplinary Act of the Commonwealth of Australia 1982. And such things are injury or killing of non-combatants, failing to provide essential care, exposing the sick or wounded to contagion, affronting the dignity of protected people, and subjecting protected people to humiliation, intimidation, or degradation. We get into a very grey area where the person providing the care is also wearing a military uniform. Let me say, one of the reasons I was asked to give this talk to the ADF is that I have been in the Navy for over 30 years in Australia, so I appreciate the chain of command. And as I said, I've been married for a long time, so I know my position. The questions that you ask is, who received treatment and when? And something that I really threw out at the audience, and you've got to think, when I gave this talk the first time, it was an audience of purely military officers, Army, Navy, and Air Force. Harmful interrogation. When do you decide between medical duties and military imperative? It is not a simple and easy exercise. It is no longer appropriate to say I was acting under orders. I think everybody has to answer their own ethics, ego, and live in their own body and sleep in their own bed. Military goals demand protecting one's own troops. Hence, medical personnel are an imperative consideration. While damaging the opponent's position and military integrity is part of including intelligence gathering. Let me repeat, I am not giving anybody instructions of what to do or how to do it, but to question their own integrity and their own humanity. And I gave this talk in the ADF because one of my colleagues, whom I respect very much, got up and said, doctors should never be involved with aggressive interrogation. And I just didn't know if that was right or wrong. Ethics are not always a question of just right or wrong. It's not always black and white, it may be grey. Medical ethics aim to preserve life, whether that's military ethics or not. Yet military ethics justifies taking life. That's what war's all about. We've got religious pacifists. I don't know how many of you have seen that movie of the Quaker who became a conscientious objector and ended up getting the highest military recognition for bravery in America. And it's a true story. Military do provide humanitarian service and aids in times of need, including medical services. The question that arises is third-party interests should not intrude into medical model of the doctor-patient relationship. Areas such as public health, criminal justice, or economic efficiency often expect a doctor to act in ways that is less relevant to the doctor-patient relationship. Medical ethics in time, it is said that medical ethics in war and peace are the same thing. I put it to you that in reality, that's not the case. Principles of contemporary just war may simply override many of the bioethical concerns. That's not my words. I put it in quotation, and it comes from Enmark's paper in the Journal of Military Ethics 2008. Others argue exactly what I've said, and the nature of war has changed to conflicts between nation states and sub-state actors, including guerrillas, insurgents. This has led to fundamental conflict between medical necessity and military imperative. There is a clear tension between treating one's own, and this is why I said the previous talk was a beautiful segue into this talk. There is undoubted conflict in assisting interrogations that involve harm to detainees. There must be a conflict in not assisting in such interrogation in the same way that there is a conflict in assisting in such interrogation, and each person will have to live with their own conscience. And you'll be happy to know this is the last slide, and I think I'm still pretty close to the 20 minutes.
Actually well under.
There is a tension between ethical requirement for impartiality in the provision of humanitarian assistance and the military necessity of prioritizing care for one's own troops. And this is exactly the issues that came through in the previous talk, and as I said, a beautiful segue for what I'm sharing with you today. And I thought a final note, which is really quite illuminating, is there are 17 states in America which demand physician participation in execution using lethal injection, and those people are protected by law from any challenges to the violation of medical ethics. Again, that is not my statement. It is a statement of Enmark from the Journal of Military Medicine 2008. So what is my, as we had take-home message from the previous talk, the take-home message that I give you is I don't believe we can prescribe ethics. It is something that we internalize, we accept. And let me give you a final message that I thought encapsulated this talk completely. And it was, I gave this talk to the ADF, and the next time there was a military medicine meeting, an officer got up and told his story about the Falklands War, which he had carried with him for 30 years, where he actually shot 2 of his own troops for humanitarian reasons, because they had been so burnt by Exocet missiles going into the Sir Galahad warship, and those warships were made of aluminium and they melted. And they also melted the troops inside them. They were beyond redemption and they were beyond pain relief. And I thought, this sincere officer getting up and sharing that story when I heard about it, because I wasn't actually in the audience, I considered it one of the greatest compliments of my career, that you could actually use an argument that I've tried to use with you today to say ethics are up to you, each one of you individually, each one of you to understand who and what you are, what is your obligation to humanity. Humanity is not black and white. Humanity is somewhere in between. For this man to get up and share his story, break down and cry in front of a room full of his fellow officers, brought them to their knees as well as him. I don't want too many tears today, but I do want you to go away and think about the ethics of humanity.